The EU has passed the test. That's the assessment of the European Union's Commissioner for Migration after an emergency meeting that was called in response to last week's breach of Spain's border with Morocco. The incident sparked calls from some EU member states to suspend Spain from EU border agreements. Instead, interior ministers agreed on Tuesday to step up efforts against people smuggling and disinformation. Spain says almost all the 72,000 migrants who crossed into Ceuta have since returned to Morocco and that none of them have crossed into mainland Spain.
Migrants who entered Ceuta from Morocco stranded on the beach, their fate in limbo. Spain says an estimated 2,000 remain in its North African exclave after last week's mass breach of the border. Aid workers have begun handing out food and water. For many of the migrants, the first help after several days of waiting. But while the vast majority of last week's arrivals have since returned to Morocco, the political fallout is far from over. Scenes of tens of thousands of people crossing the EU's external border uncontrolled sparked an immediate backlash against Spain from some EU member states. An emergency meeting of EU interior ministers was called for Tuesday to discuss what happened in Ceuta. Spain told other EU members that none of the bloc's internal border security mechanisms was compromised and that none of the migrants moved on to other countries, a position backed up by the EU.
For the time being, Europe, I think, has definitely passed this test. People did not manage to enter the Schengen area, and security at the border was resolved quickly. The key now is for the European Union to act, I would say, in a united manner and also draw the right conclusions from these events.
But Italy, with its own hardline stance on migration, says the Ceuta border incident shows the need for even tougher policies. Many of the migrants remaining in Ceuta say they're hoping to apply for asylum. And even if they're pushed back to Morocco, their dreams of a better life in Europe aren't going to go away.
Our special correspondent Nimisha Jaiswal is in Ceuta and joins us from there now. Nimisha, bring us up to date. What's happening where you are today?
Well, Terry, I've spent most of the day and the morning in the Ceuta city centre talking to residents, and things have really come back to normal compared to the scenes of last weekend when all the shops and commercial establishments were shuttered in fear of what could happen soon after the migrant surge. A lot of people here saying that they are still very concerned, but when it comes to what the authorities are telling us about what is the fate of the remaining migrants, as we just saw in that report, they are saying that their focus right now is going to be on minor females from this migrant group who they say are the most at risk. So we are hearing that there's a school near the Morocco and Ceuta border where they would like to help these girls find shelter. We're also hearing that Spanish authorities are actually setting up helplines for Moroccan families that are looking for missing loved ones who went missing soon after the surge. There are concerns, of course, because dozens have been reported killed, and Spanish authorities have offered their empathy and have encouraged Moroccan families to reach out to help identify if their missing loved ones are the ones that unfortunately lost their lives during the surge.
Now, Ceuta is quite small. This must have been a shock for residents there when tens of thousands of people suddenly arrived unexpectedly. Do the residents of Ceuta, have a clear idea of how this happened?
Well, Terry, many theories floating around and lots of interesting stances when we've spoken to different people. Some have called this an invasion, an attack on Spain, and are pretty upset at Spanish authorities. Some even saying that they were supporters of Pedro Sanchez, but feel like he's not being strong enough right now, and that the policies of Spain have perhaps even encouraged this surge that we saw. Others are blaming Morocco. They're calling this a political ploy. They're saying that this is just Morocco exerting its ability to allow for something like this to happen, because of course there are reports floating around that this could have been politically motivated. There's also anger because there have been reports that have emerged saying that Spanish authorities did have a warning maybe a day or two before this surge actually happened. So even though there's no clear sense of what exactly happened, people are telling us that they have heard reports about social media disinformation, that they've heard reports that the Spanish government has not done enough. And there's a fair amount of frustration as well as anger about this, because even when many people told us here, they expressed empathy for the migrants. They said that nobody wants to leave their homes if they didn't have a desperate situation back home. But they've also expressed frustration that a small town like this cannot possibly accommodate tens and thousands of people. And while they really hope this doesn't happen again, they see that they don't see any clear pathways to prevent that from happening. Some even saying to us that there needs to be a more robust military and security presence on this border around the year, all the time.
We heard accounts initially of migrants struggling to find food and other basic necessities when they arrived there in Ceuta. The vast majority have since returned to Morocco, of course, but what about those who remained there? What sort of conditions are they facing now?
Well, Terry, the conditions are definitely very difficult. The numbers we are receiving are mixed. There are, of the 50 to 70,000 people that we were told have crossed in that period and the days leading up to it, only about 2,000 remain, but this number also varies depending on if you ask the Ceuta authorities or the Spanish authorities. Of these people, we've been to a beach that's close to a reception center in Ceuta where hundreds are sheltering out in the open, and sheltering may be the wrong word to use here because, of course, this is an exposed beach. It is very high temperatures over here, and they've been lying there without food, without water for days now since they arrived. That being said, we do know that the military has been bringing out water perhaps once in a day. We saw one of these convoys come in yesterday, as well as we heard reports that there was a truck that came in day before, as well as now the Red Cross has also shown up to provide food. Now, the migrants we spoke to up until then had said they'd received absolutely no food. Some reports had come through of residents going out to offer some food, but these are hundreds of people and it's difficult to manage with any small amounts of food. So the Red Cross's help, of course, appreciated. But many here also telling us that despite the fact that there's no food, there's no water, they're determined to stay on, they're determined to approach reception centers and find shelter in Europe, because most of the people we talked to said this was not their first attempt to reach Europe, some fleeing violence in their native countries, some fleeing political persecution, some fleeing just a complete lack of opportunity. They've said they've long held this dream of coming to Europe, and they're determined now that they've finally made it due to the circumstances that emerged during this episode in Ceuta that they do not want to go back. So even despite the difficult conditions that they're clearly facing, there is a will to really stay put here.
Nimisha, thank you very much for your reporting. That was our special correspondent, Nimisha Jaiswal in Ceuta. Well, our Brussels correspondent, Rosie Birchard, has been following all of this too and joins us now. Rosie, EU interior ministers have held an emergency meeting online today to discuss what happened in Ceuta. What came out of that meeting?
Terry, a real change of tune, at least in terms of the rhetoric from other EU countries towards Spain. They were expressing solidarity and saying they stood by Spain. Now, of course, that is in opposition to what we saw over the weekend, which was a kind of cacophony of different responses from EU states and quite a lot of blame laid at Spain's feet. The EU's Migration Commissioner said that the EU had faced a test to its security and also to its solidarity, and this is a test that it had passed. Now, of course, if it were not the EU itself writing that report card, I think you might see some very different assessments of what this actually means for the EU, given especially on that solidarity point that there were such divisions. And also, I think what this is a reminder of is that if you want to destabilise the entire EU politically, migratory pressure on one border is certainly a way to do it. I mean, there was such political fallout from these dramatic images that we saw over the weekend. The EU's Migration Commissioner also really wanted to stress that irregular migrant arrivals to the EU up until now in this year have been really falling. We've seen historic lows in some countries, including Sweden and Denmark. But he says he understands also that these were dramatic images that would have shocked people across the EU. And he also paid tribute to the dozens of people who died in these events over in Ceuta and noted that each one of them means a person whose family will no longer see them.
And we did hear a number of EU countries criticizing Spain, initially at least, but Ceuta is not part of the Schengen travel area. It's not connected to the European mainland. Most of the migrants who crossed to Ceuta were swiftly returned to Morocco. So why are other EU member states so concerned, Rosie?
Well, that is precisely the question that Spain has been raising. It has especially been locking horns with Italy, which suspended Schengen cooperation with Spain. Now, as you pointed out, Ceuta is not part of the Schengen area. That's that ID check-free travel zone within the European Union. And therefore, Spain says that Schengen was not compromised in terms of its security whatsoever, and that Italy's reaction was unnecessary and irrational. Now, the EU will be assessing Italy's reaction, and in theory it could come up with a similar kind of review of it, but I think you'll see that the EU is trying to kind of keep a bit of a distance here. Remember that both Spain and Italy, big EU countries, face elections next year, and I don't think we're going to see any sort of a making up and shaking hands between these two countries anytime soon. They'll probably continue to lock horns and to accuse each other of mismanaging or spreading the wrong kind of information.
Well, as you mentioned, Rosie, migration is a pressure point for Europe. To what degree is the Ceuta incident being exploited by anti-immigrant political groups in Europe?
Look, we have seen far-right activists descending on Ceuta, putting blame towards Spain for policies including regularising around 500,000 undocumented migrants earlier this year. Worth noting, the EU Commissioner said today there is no direct link that can be seen between that policy from Spain and these events that we saw unfolding in Ceuta. But it's not just the far right of the political spectrum. We've also seen the centre-right here in Europe pointing to this as a reason why they say that more drastic migration measures are needed, particularly what they call so-called return hubs. EU laws have been changed in recent months to put a legal pathway in place for EU states to negotiate deals with other countries outside the EU, especially in Africa, on the African continent, to have kind of centres set up outside the EU's territory where migrants could be sent to have their asylum claims processed, or even as part of a one-way ticket out of Europe. Germany is one of the countries that is pushing for that. Migrant rights groups and rights watchdogs are very critical of that, and they say the EU there is essentially shirking its own responsibility.
You mentioned solidarity, an expression of solidarity from the European Union towards Spain in this situation. We've heard EU officials declare that in this situation, but does that translate, Rosie, into any kind of practical support for Spain that would demonstrate that solidarity?
Some practical support. So Frontex, the EU's border agency, has around 30 officials on the ground in Ceuta now supporting authorities there. And we've also seen Europol, so that's the agency that allows law enforcement across the EU to cooperate, getting involved also in investigating the causes behind this. What we did not see, Terry, and this is different to past migration crises we've seen, for example, the likes of on the Italian island of Lampedusa, we did not see the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen arriving in Ceuta to express solidarity. Instead, what we saw was quite a lot of criticism from EU states, and many felt that EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was also being pretty critical toward Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister. As I said, a kind of change of tune, what we've seen there today, and now they are stressing solidarity, but does it really match up in terms of actions? I think the Spanish would say, no, it doesn't.
There's been a great deal of speculation about how this happened, that suddenly tens of thousands of people could just cross through that border between Morocco and Ceuta. Is there any consensus now at EU level having looked at this now for a few days on how this happened, Spain insists it had no intelligence indicating that this was about to happen.
The EU's migration commissioner was quite tight-lipped on this. He said, we know that this crisis was fueled by criminal smuggling networks and also that disinformation spread online was to blame. But he really wouldn't go any further than that, just saying that Spanish and Europol investigations are ongoing. The migration commissioner was asked repeatedly if Morocco bears any responsibility for this crisis. Remember that back in 2021, Morocco did ease some border controls into Ceuta, which did result in thousands of people crossing, but that was as part of a diplomatic standoff with Spain. Interestingly, this time round, what you see is that EU officials are being extremely careful not to point the finger at Morocco, and so is Spain. In fact, the EU migration chief and the Spanish authorities are commending Morocco and praising it for what they say was its role in helping to stabilise the situation.
Rosie, thank you so much. That was our correspondent, Rosie Birchard, in Brussels.